Okay, so folks, this is probably the last lecture you're going to get of till 2021. And you're going to get this. You can watch it over Christmas break. You watch it before Christmas break. We get back, we'll finish up the French Revolution and talk about this and Napoleon. And then we'll move on. We'll have an assessment, probably a DBQ, and some type of multiple choice, which will function as kind of our final. And then that's it. We'll move on into the 19th century. So now, the French Revolution, this is one of those moments in world history where you know exactly when it happened because everyone knew it was a thing. It wasn't something historians made up, obviously. Two is this is really a turning point in history of what, like, if you look at like in American history, there's America before the Civil War and there's America after the Civil War, right? That there's two different Americas. Same thing in American history of America before the World Wars, between before World War I and World War II, and America after the World Wars. And I would even say that after the end of the Cold War, right? There's like this 9/11. After 9/11, there's this America before 9/11 and America after 9/11. Okay. Well, in European history, it's the same thing. There's Europe before the before the Renaissance and Reformation, and then there's Europe after. Right? Notice how they're different. We talked about that. And then same way here. There's everything between the between French Revolution and Renaissance and Reformation, and then after it's going to be different. And then again, you're going to see the same thing after the First and Second World Wars. So there's these moments, these watershed moments where what's coming in isn't the same coming out, right? So this is a good question for AP and the change in continuity, where you can compare two time periods of what's the same and what's different. Okay, all right. So what caused the French Revolution? Now, obviously, I've given you some documents to look at, and we'll talk about that part in class. But a quick overview again is one of the things that's going to cause this is the huge amount of French debt. And in here it talks about on the slide the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. Well, those are kind of the thing, like the icing on the cake that created a huge amount of debt. France had faced huge amounts of debt before this. That they had the 7 Years' War, they had the Anglo-Dutch wars, the wars. They'd had huge wars before this, and the funding they'd done for the 30 Years' War. France had racked up a huge amount of debt, and that debt then had devalued the French franc, which created huge amounts of inflation. Think like the Spanish and what we talked about, the price revolution, where they had pulled in so much gold that it devalued the currency. Well, this is the opposite. This is where you owe so much money, it devalued your currency. We see that today with America, with the amount of debt America's incurred, it reduces the value of the American dollar and the buying power, which then is going to cause food issues because even though people had the money to buy these things, they can't buy them because their money is worthless. On top of that, what's driving the inflation is that little mini ice age had also caused crop failures. Now, obviously, the English were able to compensate because of their scientific applications to agriculture, but the French weren't adopting them as quickly. So their production was low. The crops had failed, means less food, which means higher prices, driven also by huge amounts of debt. So even though you had the food on the shelves, people couldn't buy it, which made this situation even worse. On top of that, you've got a society where the first estate, the clergy, own huge amounts of land and pay no taxes and have huge amounts of political power. And then the second estate, which is the nobility, owns huge amounts of land, pays little or no taxes, gets a pension from the government. In other words, they get payments from the government. Because remember, the Louis were afraid of the nobility. And so they are doing everything to make the nobility happy, and they're ignoring the common people. And the third estate owns little land, pays huge amounts of taxes, and has little or no political power. And on top of that, you've got the peasantry that's locked in the corvée, which is serfdom. On top of that, you have the Enlightenment, all these middle class, upper class, wealthy, educated individuals who have been reading Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and you got the common man who just went and fought in the American Revolution, bringing back the ideas of self rule. All of that tied together with an incompetent leader in Louis the 16th, who basically can't make up his own mind if someone tells him what to do, basically sums up the problem here, that France is a hot mess and it's just waiting. It's a powder keg waiting to go off. And here's where it goes off, is that those parliaments, the French royal court had dominated basically by these hereditary nobilities, it made it hard to tax the wealthy. And they were abolished under Louis the 15th, but Louis the 16th had brought them back. And so these parliaments, they don't want to raise taxes because, and if they do want to raise taxes, they want to raise them on the lower class, not on them. So they're going to pass the buck. And then so you're going to hire a new finance minister, a man named Necker, who is a middle class, educated bourgeoisie. He comes in and says, here's what you need to do. You got to make everybody pay taxes, not just the poor, everybody. And you got to stop spending money. Of course, when you tell people things like that, they tend to fire you, which is exactly what they did. So they hired this guy. Okay, Calonne come in and he says, hey, guess what? What we're going to do is put a new land tax in. We're going to make everybody, regardless of class, pay it. Well, that didn't work. And especially when you say everybody should have to pay the taxes, nobody wants to do that. So they fired him and they hired a new person in. Okay. Well, before that, they said, well, let's get a special council. So they get a special council of nobles together. And the special nobles, these are groups of high ranking nobles, and they say, well, we don't want to handle this because they don't want to be a political enemy. So they say, call the Estates General. Call that meeting of those three estates, the clergy, the nobles, and the estates, the commoners, the third estate. Bring them all in. Have them talk about this. Well, that didn't go over well because they fired Calonne, got a new person in. He basically calls an assembly of clergy to pay their debts. He says, hey, make the clergy pay. That didn't go over well. The parliaments don't want to do it. So basically, he resigns and we get Necker again. And Necker goes, hey, by the way, remember what I told you before? Do that. Make everybody pay. Guess what's going to happen to Necker? Oh, he gets fired, but this time they're going to call the estates. And like I said, these estates aren't equal. The clergy have huge amounts of power, huge amounts of land, and pay no taxes. The nobility have huge amounts of land, pay little or no taxes, and actually get a pension from the government for being a noble. Many of these are those nobles of the robe. So there's like 400,000 of these people, right? On top of it, these first two estates each get one vote as a group. So it's 2-1. The Estates General the third estate only gets one vote. And they pay almost all the taxes, have little or no political power, and own little or no land. Can you see the problem here? Can you see how this is going to be a bad thing? So since nobody, the assembly of notables, the nobles can't make a demand. They demand that the Estates General be called, and they're going to say that look, this assembly of notables that are individuals of high esteem say that the estates should have equal amount of representatives, and that they're going to say that everybody should get a vote, but they just give the commons one vote, and so it doesn't end well. The third estate basically says, no, 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 no. This isn't going to work. So we need, and there are members of the other two estates, the first and second estate, that actually support the third estate in saying this isn't going to work. Okay, you got to have everybody have equal representation. And then create this cashiers of dolents is basically here's our list of grievances. We want to end government waste. We want indirect taxes to get rid of. We want the church to pay taxes. We want to end corruption, and we want equal taxation. We want measures that basically get rid of mercantilism to allow for free trade, and we want some of those rights that we heard about back in that thing called America. Well, that didn't work because they get booted out. They basically, when they're in session, they go out of session for a moment. The third estate leaves the conference. When they come back, the doors are locked and they won't let them in. So they basically, the members of the third estate and the people that supported them in the other two estates who were locked out of the meeting go to a tennis court there at Versailles. And there they take the oath of the tennis court saying they will create a constitutional government that has limited powers on the king, allows equal representation, and reforms the economics of the country. So yay! We took the oath of tennis court and there's no bloodshed. The revolution, no, wait. Back in Paris, it's a little bit different. So in Paris, Necker, who'd been fired again, decides to walk in to a coffee shop. I think you might have read about this, and says there's army coming, which, by the way, the army wasn't coming. But, Necker's got to watch out for himself. And that sparks a revolution. Fearing the approaching army, deciding the people need to have gunpowder, they go to the only place in Paris that stores gunpowder, which would be the Bastille, which is a prison that had held many political prisoners. They're really after the gunpowder. So they storm the Bastille, kill the governor of the Bastille and several of the guards, and they take the gunpowder. Lafayette, later supervising this National Guard to defend the city of Paris, also will be the person who oversees the tearing down of the Bastille. So at Versailles, you've got a constitutional government forming. In Paris, you have an armed rebellion taking place, seizing gunpowders and forming a revolutionary army. Oh, wait for it. It gets better. So you're going to see this idea of the liberté, the equality, fraternity being formed, the August decrees, that they're going to create the tricolores, the symbol of France. And it all sounds so great. Well, and then, okay, so constitutional government forming in Versailles, armed rebellion taking place in Paris. In the countryside around that, the peasantry rise up. They fear the idea of approaching armies. Again, I don't know where they're coming from, but there's approaching armies. And then they decide they're going to free themselves. So they storm to the aristocracy's houses. They storm in their houses and they seize all the paperwork that would basically claim who they belong to, burning them, destroying all the paperwork, and ending any type of corvée. They basically end serfdom by raiding people's homes and destroying all the paperwork so no one can prove who belongs to who. And on top of that, they're also looting the houses. So they end serfdom. So again, Versailles, constitutional government, Paris, armed rebellion, countryside, just in an uproar and ending serfdom. Where's the king? Hunting. When all this happens, he doesn't know what's happening. He basically doesn't know it was happening and didn't really do anything to stop it because he's Louis XVI. He's a schlub, as Madame Pompadour called him. He wanted to be a clockmaker. He didn't want to be king. Yeah. No, no, him and his wife were actually really good at spending money. She spent like $30,000 in one hand of poker. She had an entire peasant village built for her. I mean, yeah, it was just totally messed up. And they don't know what's going on. The king's isolated because he's 13 miles away in Paris, and on top of it, he's not a very good king. So, yay! All right. And that led to the Declaration of the Rights of Men. This came out of the National Assembly, which basically, like the Declaration of Independence, says this is what your rights are, but they're in more detail, way more detail, and it sets a kind of a goalpost of what is equality and the concepts of popular sovereignty. However, women are not included in this. And this document is so important that it's been sent to space. It's part of the UN Charter. It's part of part of Amnesty International's charter. So this is a really important thing. But again, notice it's a Declaration of Rights of Men. Women got left out. So if you think about this, the French Revolution, one of the major forces in the French Revolution is women. And we're going to see that in the next slide. Because what happened in October is the food prices got worse. Because of the revolution and because other governments don't want to trade with the French, the prices got worse. And so the French people are starving, and namely the children. And the women go, there's enough of this. We're going to do something about it. And they hear about the queen eating lavish meals and everything. And there's the infamous let them eat cake line, which she never gave. What if she gave it? It was she's talking about the loose cakes, like the extra dough that's baked up from bread. Like if they can't buy the good stuff, buy the cheap stuff. Like buy generic. It was probably one of her ladies in waiting had said that, but not her. But it doesn't matter because the women in Paris have had enough, and so they go and they march on the palace and force the men to come that forced the king to return to Versailles, or from Versailles to Turlane's palace. They tried to kill the queen. They tried to kill the queen, but he saves her life at the last minute. So these women hauling cannon and swords and pikes and everything else they can get their hands on, axes and clubs, go and force the king and his family back to Turlanes. So wait a minute. So the women are integral into the revolution, but yet they don't get to be part of the Declaration of Rights of Men. See how that works? So, and we're going to form a constitutional government out of this. They're going to have legislation that limit the power of the king. They give equal taxation for everyone and rights to vote, except for women, of course. But you're going to see women pushing back against this. Olympia de Goya she's going to write the Declaration of Rights of Women, which basically says women should be treated like citizens, like men are, which again points out that women aren't being treated like men. All right. And then we're going to divide up the territories that used to be underneath the power of the nobility. They're going to divide them up into departments so they can be easily ran by the new elected government. So we're restructuring France. This is Goya's. And so there also be limits. The Catholic Church was linked into the corruption of the government because they didn't pay taxes and because that whole Richelieu thing and everything. And the Catholic Church was seen as part of the monarchy. And so there's a reform that basically said that the Catholic Church, that priests had to answer to the secular state, that they're part of the government. And so therefore they have to swear an oath to the government, which of course Pope Pius VI is not having. He does not think that's a good idea. All right. They're also going to ban unions, which you think, wait a minute, isn't this a revolution for the people? Well, we also have to think economics here, folks. We're also going to take away all that Catholic Church land and we're going to give it back to the state. Well, this sounds like a great idea, except for the fact that they create kind of a Ponzi scheme. Is that they create this thing called the assignats, which basically they issue government bonds and they use the land from the Catholic Church to back those bonds. So so they're basically taking out a title loan, if that makes sense. Well, the problem is they take out more loans than they could possibly pay back. That devalues the currency. All right. And so if you look at, it's going to basically cause an economic depression, that since they took that money out and they issue these bonds, but the bonds are more than the amount of land they have, it creates a kind of a deflation system. And so the entire system collapses. And so they fall further into debt and higher inflation. So instead of solving their problems, they actually made it worse by trying to sell the Catholic Church land as bonds. So see how that works? And they're basically circulating worthless money because there's nothing to back it, and it creates a huge amount of inflation. And then we also see an introduction of Enlightenment ideas. Um, they're legalizing divorce, inheritance. There's an abolition of slavery during this time. They put in the metric system, right? They're gonna that constitutional. There's So that's the idea that basically divided the Catholic populations out of this. So this is the departments thing. So it actually created. Notice how many departments they are. That's just one country. Imagine trying to run this. So the hierarchy, the bureaucracy, nothing's getting done with 83 departments, 83 states in a country the size of what? The Midwest. Figure that out. Okay. So, and there's also a pushback. And this is what we call this whole first phase, the part from where the king signs the Constitution all the way up to where we're about at is the Montesquieu phase, because it's a checks and balance system. We're basically putting in things to keep the system from being too much power one way or the other, which sounds like a great idea. We've signed a constitutional monarchy, we put in a Bill of Rights, we took away power from the Catholic Church. That this is the Montesquieu phase. The next phase is the Rousseau phase. All right. And so the emigres are those aristocracy that either fled or were in France but lived abroad. So there are French who live in other countries or had fled. Okay. And of course, Louis XVI tries to flee. So he signed a constitutional monarchy and now he tries to skedaddle. And the whole time, there's a group called the Jacobins who had been telling them that, look, don't trust this guy, don't trust this guy. And the moderates, the Girondinists and the royalists are saying, no, 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 it's going to be okay. He's one of us. And then he tries to run, and that's going to trigger the next. On top of it, you've got Emperor Leopold II wants his niece back, who is, or his, yeah, I think it's his niece, is Marie Antoinette. And of course, Frederick Wilhelm II of Prussia, they're like, well, we can't have this going on. So they're putting pressure, military pressure. And then the Duke of Brunswick, who's a German, says basically if anyone harms the royal family, he will raise the city of Paris. And so it's France versus everyone. Now you're going to notice Britain's like, oh, game on. Somebody, we're not even part of this. But hey, by the way, if there's a war, we want some of this. Piedmont's going to be something in Spain. We're going to talk about Piedmont, Sardinia again later. That there's a reason why they're in here. And Spain, well, Spain's looking to become independent again. So, all right. But the biggest problem is the king flees and they haul him back. He gets caught at the border and they haul him back. And everybody's like, I told you. I told you. And after Brunswick's decree, they basically go into Tourlaise where he held all these prisoners, and it's a slaughter. For like several days, they go from room to room, raping and killing and murdering all these nobility that are trapped in Tourlaise. And no one tries to stop them. It's just a killing fest as they go from place to place. In England, and we're going to talk about this. He's in the readings you got. But Burke basically writes, and this is where Burke was basically that Burke basically had looked at the American Revolution. He's an English conservative, and he basically said that the American Revolution was somewhat justified in that they were English subjects and they need to be treated as English subjects. But then when it comes to the French Revolution, he goes, look, you cannot fundamentally overnight change a society. That you can't just go, all right, we're going to stop today being this and tomorrow be this. Is that change happens over time. You just can't flip a switch. All right. He's the one who also supposedly credited it's a totally like botched version of his quote, but it's like that the reason why evil exists is because good men will do nothing. Burke basically looks at what's coming in the French Revolution and says, when you fundamentally change a society, this is what's going to happen. It's going to go bad. And guess what? He's right. So, and then Pitt's like, oh, let's do this. All right. Pitt basically is supporting this. He actually approved the suspending of the act of habeas corpus to prevent anything like this happening back in England. And anything that sounds like an overthrow of the government, Pitt, who is the prime minister, says then it'll be treasonable. But we're all for going against the French Revolution here. So all right. So this is what it looks like. All these German states, everyone coming after the French. And France actually does win a little bit and expand it. So here's the thing. Okay. So you had the Jacobins, who are the far left, right? The Girondinists, who are the conservatives, economically and politically. And then there's the royalists. These people had said, trust the king. These people weren't sure the plain, which is this middle of the road, could go either way. Well, the Girondinists now, because the king tried to flee, falls in with the Jacobites and the Montagnards, the mountain. These are the far left. These are the people who want to totally fundamentally change society. So when the king fled, it all shifts to this side. That's why this is called the Rousseau side, because it's the will of the people. Now, the will of the people is a good thing when you have elections. It's a bad thing when it leads to dictators, like this, right? So they basically force the king and Marie Antoinette into prison. The Jacobins do, and they want to fundamentally change society. They want to change it, and these are the Jacobins. So, And you're going to see the Parisian, the small shopkeepers, the sans-culottes, then become the arm of the Jacobins. These small tradesmen, artisans who've been under economic and political, they're called the sans-culottes because they wear full pants. They don't wear the culottes. Okay. And so they're going to become the political arm of the Jacobites. And so what happens after the September massacre, 1,200 people are murdered in Paris from this. They're going to form the convention, which forms a new government with the backing of the sans-culottes. And the Jacobites then are going to put in fundamental changes, right, to change this system and to put it under their control to strengthen and protect the monarchy or the revolution. That's what this is about. They want to change France to protect what they've got. And to do this, they call for the execution of Louis XVI, who's beheaded, and then later the Queen. So this is that massacre we talked about, where they kill thousands. They just murder and rape their way through this. And then, so this starts the tribunals then. Marie Antoinette and the royal family are killed, Guérenon's politicians, peasants. The largest group that can be executed is the peasants. And this is where we see the guillotining. We're also going to see people shot and people drowned, especially out in the countryside. So this is the execution. That's Louis. And they cut his head off. This is Marie Antoinette when they cut her head off. We'll talk more about the executions in class. And so this is the leader of the Jacobins, is Maximilien Robespierre, and he runs this through the Committee of Public Safety. And so it comes basically as this tribunal of political power to exact. So if they write an arrest warrant, then that happens. And they bring those people in, and they're working off these lists. Marat was a newspaperman who had lived for a period of time in the sewers, and now, because of a skin irritation, has to spend most of his time in a bathtub. Marat is a firebrand. He believes there are conspiracies and people out to get the revolution everywhere. And so Marat is actually writing list after list after list of people who are accused of being against the revolution and printing them in the paper, which then are executed by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. Danton, he is the leader of the Guérenonists. And why he's important is that he's not overly important in the executions and protecting the revolution that way. He's the one who creates the levée en masse, the draft, that basically every young man who is capable of defending France is called up in this huge army that's going to be, and the fact that they can be drawn from all different quarters of society, and the leadership is drawn from all sides of society, is what led to Napoleon. So he's the one for the draft. He's the one that lists the conspirators, and he's the executioner. Okay. And so the Committee of Public Safety is the thing that's going to be driving this executive branch of dictatorial power, that they basically, if they think you are against the revolution, they're going to take you out. And like I said, the levée en masse is this, where they're going to call up all these people, that they're going to, all this needed goods and everything. They also control prices of food and things like that. So, but that's what protects France. And so you're going to get an army of 500,000, and then you put them into power, and you're an army based on merit. That's how Napoleon, who was not of high class, gets moved up, and he becomes the dictator later. And so you have revolutionary tribunals, right? You're going to have these ideas, these committees that are basically, fighting against these things, are fighting against the revolution. You're going to have the Committee of Public Safety sends down these tribunals and arrests of all these people who are seen as a threat to society. And they're going to execute thousands. Thousands of people are executed by this. Oops, sorry. And what really feeds it, you're also going to see the law of General Maxim, which set limited prices on grains. So they're handing down things to control inflation. The laws of suspects, the laws that basically gave broad sweeping powers to the government to place anyone under arrest that they thought was against the revolution. So they're controlling prices and food. The final thing where it kind of goes over the top and becomes what we call the tear was with the death of Marat. Marat was killed by this woman, by Corday, because her members of her family had been on his list and been executed. But if you look at the picture, doesn't Marat look a bit like a martyr? Yeah, that's how they paint him. And then she gets executed, Corday does. And so now there's a huge repression of women because of Marat's assassination. Is that Limba Goyaz is executed. They're barred from the convention. Women are banned in society, from the societies that they were, the Girondinists and the Jacobites. So there's a repression of women because of the assassination of Marat, and then that triggered the tear. That the only way that tear is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, and flexible. If we just kill enough people, then the revolution will be safe, and we won't have to worry, and it'll be safe. So thousands are going to be massacred in the tear. But notice the biggest populations aren't the nobility and clergy who you think they are. They feed on themselves. The revolution feeds on itself. And this is the English view of the revolution. And then there's a revolt because of food prices, and because of the levée en masse out in the Vendée, who the peasants hadn't seen, who are mostly are royalists, haven't seen any type of land reform or price controls, and they've seen all their young men hauled off to fight. And so there's a rebellion, which then gets crushed by the military itself. So the government goes out and they murder thousands of people. They drowned them, beat them with the oars in the river, shoot cannons through them. I mean, they level entire cities out in the countryside. So, like I said, high taxes. They resent also they're resenting that. That's the conservative part, and they haven't seen any benefit. So, and that's the Vendée where they go and they murder, drown. And there's also a movement to de-Christianize the country. They changed the name of Notre Dame to the Temple of Reason. They changed the calendar so you don't even know when a Sundays are. They get rid of all the religious holidays and religious names. They destroy church icons. Many of the clergy were executed. So there's that new calendar. So it gets rid of all the religious holidays and anything. And the number of the years start with the revolution. That's Notre Dame. And then they even hold a festival of the Supreme Being where Maximilian Robespierre himself appears adorned in robes with the new constitution. And that was kind of a point too far. That at that point it had gone a little too far. This idea of getting rid of the Catholic Church had kind of it pushed away the rural populations, and Robespierre could never like get the support he needed, right, for this liberty cult. And so in the end, everything turned on Robespierre. Everything turned. And part of it's also the fact that they don't like his reforms, and on top of it, they don't like the economic things had economics had basically come through, and the system had gotten better. So people had more money in that, and so there wasn't really a need for this. Plus, the enemies had been defeated. Napoleon and other generals had drove off the enemies, so the economy got better. The enemies are gone, and then on top of it, they don't like what Robespierre is saying anymore. They don't like this, and so here's your French victories. That And so Robespierre goes in, comes in with this law of 22 parler, which basically the tribunal convicts suspects again. And he comes in with this list of names, and they shout him down. And Robespierre is hauled off, he and his supporters. Robespierre is in his office. They hear a gunshot, hear two gunshots, and they hear a gunshot and no, two gunshots and a crash. One of his aides had thrown himself out the window. One of the aides had shot himself, and Robespierre had shot himself in the face, but he'd missed, and the gun had shot off part of his jaw. And so they basically tie up his jaw, lay him on the table, and debate what to do with him while he's dying. Then they haul him off and cut his head off the same way they did before. Basically, the revolution turned on itself. There's the arrest of Robespierre, okay, being held off, and they're debating what to do with him. And so this led us to, and there's a pushback against this is the Thermidorian reaction that the influential, wealthy, middle class professionals push out the sans culotte. And we're going to get the Committee of Public Safety has gotten rid of, and we try to basically go back to way things were, and they wipe out a bunch of these um, Jacobins. They basically it feeds on itself. They wipe out the Jacobins, and so the next year they reject the constitutional monarchy democracy. They establish two houses, and in the end, they're going to create this new democracy, but they're going to create this thing called the directory that has so because they want to keep power from getting concentrated in the hands of someone like Robespierre, and that led to um, dividing it between five presidents, which was not working either. It's way too weak, and so we're back to the same problems we had before. The old forces come in, and it's going to be a mess. And that's what led to Napoleon. Napoleon overthrows the directory and fixes the problems. All right, on to Napoleon.